I have to reorientate myself. This has been a while. I think the last time I preached was in April. I said to Gary when I was preparing, I'm like, I feel out of practice. So forgive me if my words don't flow. Also, forgive me for the subject. No, let me rephrase that. Forgive me for my emotions because of the subject. So last night when I was preparing, I reached one text where I was reading about Isaiah entering into the throne room, and I'll get to it in a bit. But I found myself crying and asked Leash, I don't cry. So I'm like, God, this is not going to work. How can you talk and blubber at the same time? So bear with me. But I do pray that today's subject will, you will encounter God in another way. So we're doing this mini series. You know, we like to do series in this church. And Sacred Spaces has come a very special kind of theme for me. Recently, I've been studying under Dr. Michael Heiser, and he has brought about this concept that we are sacred spaces. So this is kind of very close to my heart. My head is very full with a lot of scholarly, academic language that I have to have the dictionary to figure out what they're trying to say to me. And I know this is very light level stuff, so sometimes I'm just like, just hang on, let me just look this up because I have no idea what you guys are trying to say. Just use normal language, but anyway, it's fine. Okay, so today we're talking on the holiness of God. And I found this quote from a guy called Paul Tripp. The doctrine of holiness is so far beyond anything in our ordinary experience that we have no comparison or categories to help us understand it. And in many ways, that is so true from our Western mindset, our modern worldview. I think we hear the word holy, and we're like, it's like another religious word that we use either in a really great old hymn, but it's a concept that we kind of struggle to understand. So I thought I'd look up a few of the verses that the Bible, there's quite a few. I just chose 3. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? Holiness is like a word like glory. Hey, we're like, okay, it's just one of those religious words we use. Here's another one. Okay, so let me go back. This was the response of people with Moses in the Exodus when all the Egyptians drowned. They were like, awesome. Like their enemies were coming and then they drowned and God came through. Next one, 1 Samuel. This is an interesting one. Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? This is a response of the Philistines when God struck 70 of them dead after they looked at the Ark of the Covenant. They kind of figured, flip, now what do we do? They realized they couldn't even stand in his presence, let alone look at the Ark. Samuel 1:2, verse 2. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. This is Hannah's prayer after she gives birth to Samuel and then decides to dedicate him to God, which means that she gave him up after praying and praying and praying for years and years and years to finally have a baby, so that she had decided after she had weaned him, she was going to give him back to the temple. That floors me. I'm like, I know a lot of people pray for babies. They finally get them, and then we don't see them back in church again. This lady now gives the very gift that God gave her after years, and this is her response. So there's something in holiness. So you guys, I can sit down now. You all understand what holiness means, right? Or do you kind of like, okay? Well, that's kind of how I was feeling as well. So before we look at what it is, let's look at what it's not. So it's not, we really struggle with some of the concepts of these words because it involves like temple rituals and there's sacrifices involved, let alone understanding what holiness means. We tend to think of it as maybe religious moral behavior or maybe pious perfection. I found these really awesome words. So, you know that holier than thou, super religious attitude? Have you ever encountered that? It's not that. To be sanctimoniously moral. Go and look it up. If you can spell it, look it up. And then to be presumptuously, piously perfect. That is not holiness. It's not a strict adherence to a set of rules or like a protocol or behavior, although there is an aspect to it. And it's also not a free-for-all, let's just do everything our way. Okay, so we know what it's not, right? You still struggling? You still get it? Do you know what it is? It's fine. We're going on a journey, so don't stress. All right, let's give you a practical example before we start unpacking what the word means. You know me, I love to unpack meanings of words because it kind of helps me understand. So let's look at the sun. It's a source, a powerful source of life for Earth, right? We know when it's not there, it's dark. When it is there, it provides light and warmth, and it helps plants grow so we can eat. There are some places on the earth, probably the northern hemisphere, when you're in the sun in winter and you feel literally no warmth from it whatsoever. Africa, you feel the warmth of it, but that doesn't mean it's not helping. The thing about the sun, though, is the closer you get, the more dangerous it becomes. Once you're in its orbit, you're going to die. So remember that example. So what does holiness actually mean? I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Hebrew word, kadosh, I think it is. That other word, so there's a root word for Hebrew, the language of Hebrew, there's always root words that mean something, and you've got to look at the root word before you, just to gain an understanding of what they mean, right? And actually what's interesting is all the Semitic languages, when it comes to the word holy, all have the same or similar meanings. So it's to be separate from or separate, to be set apart. It's to be distinct. In other words, to be a class of your own. Specifically, holiness within the Hebrew context means to be set apart for a specific purpose. Think about a coffee machine, that wonderful machine. You're not going to use it to make porridge. In other words, technically, we can say a coffee machine, and probably in Lifehouse we do, a coffee machine is holy. It's set apart. I'm not trying to diminish the word, but it's specifically set apart to do a specific job and to help us stay awake. Well, some of us. Okay, so that's holy. That's what the word means. But then there's an aspect of purity. So holy means that it's pure. It's free from the profane or defilement. And this is within a ritualistic sense, more than a moral sense. It less has a moral implication and more of a ritualistic sense. Well, what do you mean by that, Louise? Good thing you asked these questions. You guys are amazing. So the holiness of Yahweh, we've always got to start with God, right? He is literally, this is the essence of who He is. We just sang the song, there's no one like you. There's no one like God. He is utterly and completely unique, which means that He has like an otherness. There is none other like God. Both these uniqueness and the otherness relates to His holiness. So in other words, there is no one, no spiritual being, no earthly human being that in comparison to God's holiness is holy. No one can match His greatness. No one can match His power. He's in a class distinct of His own. He is uncreated, therefore that He is completely unique. And this is where I want you to pick up. He is totally, totally, totally pure from any kind of defilement, profanity. He is completely and utterly pure. Scripture seems to teach that his greatness lies completely in his holiness. And his holiness is rooted in the fact that he's the unique creator of the universe. He is literally the source of all life, all goodness, all beauty. So his otherness, his uniqueness is at the core of his holiness. However, remember that example of the sun? God's purity, even though it is so good, makes it a little dangerous for us now. In fact, pretty dangerous. The closer we become to him, the more dangerous it becomes for us. Because he is free from any defilement, guess what? We live on planet Earth. We live in a world that is full of defilement, full of the profane. He is a holy state. So he's the powerful source of light and love. He provides light, love, and I did light and love, yes. Yet the very purity of him is both good and dangerous because he is so good. That's what Tim Mackey says. So his holiness demands that humans are to be free from every defilement in order to be in his presence safely. So God's pretty clever because he knows this. So he sets up a plan. So this is in the Old Testament. So the ancient mindset would be that for holiness, it's to be separate from the profane. And when God called the Israelites to be his people, he asked them a couple of things. And one was that, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. And in order to be that, I've set you apart to be distinct, to be different from the rest of the world. In fact, this concept of otherness was at the core of their identity. This was a truth that was reinforced daily through their way of living in community life, and it was reflected through, believe it or not, every single ritual and rule and law that they had. They were called to be distinct from the other nations because God was distinct from every other god that there was. You see, the realm that God occupies, the space that he is made sacred and pure by his presence. As I said, his realm is supernatural, ours is terrestrial. Our physical realm is ordinary. His is not. He is not ordinary. This is the place we live in, is where death resides. Disease and imperfection resides because of sin. That's why his presence becomes dangerous to us. With Adam and Eden in the garden, it wasn't dangerous for them. But when sin entered in, it became dangerous for them. That's why they were removed. That's why they were taken out. It was for their safety. But God has an interesting way of... So you must understand that God's plan A, he doesn't have a plan B or C. He literally had no other plan. Plan A from the beginning was his plan. He knew we would mess it up. He knew that because of free will, we don't have it in us to be perfect. God knows that. So he had a plan. I was saying I've never had a preacher where I found so many texts from Leviticus. Who would have thought? Remember when we were doing the CBR and we had to read through Leviticus? It was nuts. I think we all started laughing at some of these things. We were like, really? So Leviticus 19:2 says, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I am I, the Lord your God, am holy. So in our Western mindset, that kind of feels like a little bit of a, I don't think I can do it. Why? Because I think we also kind of link holiness with perfection, because obviously God is perfect, and we're like, I don't think I can do that, right? That's where I want your mind shifts to kind of change today. Because they're talking about a ritual purity, which actually the Israelites never saw as sin. These rituals, okay, so today I'm going to use an example that we really all understand. I'm going to use the example of COVID. COVID hygiene. Who's tired of COVID? Who's tired of masks? It's interesting that we keep our masks on, we socially distance, for goodness sake, don't get it. And then even worse, don't get it and don't spread it, right? And then if you do, you have to isolate, you have to separate. Some people, there's family members who have had to live in their bedrooms for 10 days because of COVID, until you are better. And then you are considered clean, and you can come out and behave in society. Well, not Bruce, you won't behave, but you can come out and kind of be in society. Now, the Israelites' laws, it wasn't about hygiene or passing on viruses, although I do think that there were some practical aspects that God had in mind. But it was more to do with the fact that these ritual purities were designed by God. And it was a safety barrier for them. So the isolation from COVID, in many ways, was designed to be a safety barrier for those who would struggle if they got COVID. So they saw certain things like sickness, blood, death, being unclean. Therefore, if you'd come into contact with a dead body, there's a certain amount of ritual that you would have to go to become clean again. So what do they mean by that? You see, they took it so seriously because there were specific instructions not only for a health reason or hygiene, but it was actually for their spiritual well-being. So what do I mean by that? So they knew that because God was so pure, if they came into contact with a dead body, for instance, then coming into God's presence, that defilement of death, not the dead body, the defilement of death had tainted them. And God would never want to be associated with death, because why? He's the giver of life. He is the source of life. So there's theological reasons behind these rituals that we miss in our Western mindset because we just don't get it. We don't have a grid. So to understand, and this thing hit me, is that God, the most powerful being in the universe, who's outside of time and space, had chosen to dwell amongst their camp. Let me say that again. The most powerful being that ever is, that ever was, and ever to be, has chosen to dwell in amongst their camp. That's why these instructions from God were his measured, patient way of bringing his order into chaos so that they could make that space sacred in order for him to abide with them every day. He chose them, and he wanted not only to choose them, he wanted to be with them every day. So the sacred space idea is that wherever God dwells, whether it's in heaven, whether on earth, becomes holy. And everything else is not. So in some cases, these places such as the wilderness, which is where they were kind of moving through, was even considered hostile. So everything outside of their camp, outside of God's presence, was considered unholy, not set apart, not pure. What's interesting is that the Israelites, even on their way to the promised land, at some point, you see this in Leviticus 17, if you read that, they were still, believe it or not, sacrificing to demons. Yeah. It's called Azel. Charmaine's going to look it up. Good. Because they feared the evil forces, their worldview was that the wilderness was hostile. So they, in their broken understanding of who God was and who He is, they feared attack from these evil forces, so they thought, okay, the best way is let's sacrifice, because that's all they knew. That's why God had to implement some of these rituals to renew their thinking. So obviously this guys, this has to stop. So He implements what we understand as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is an object lesson for them, where one goat sacrificed and they cleansed the temple for a year, and then the other goat is not sacrificed. And the priest prays over the goat all the sins of the community onto the goat in a symbolic ritual, and they send the live goat out back to where it belongs. They send sin out the camp. So our modern, we like to use the word civilization, right? We struggle with this way of logic, because why would blood sacrifices and really weird rituals in our way of thinking, they're very odd. I mean, do yourself a favor and go and read Leviticus. You'll probably end up laughing. But remember, all of these have a theological purpose behind them. And it was, especially with the Day of Atonement, was to introduce now the concept of substitution. In their minds, blood was a life force, and the lesson being taught was that you can't approach God on your own terms. You approach Him on His terms, His way. And the other teaching point of this was that God was preserving life. What He was saying was that an Israelite's life was more important than, and your animal lovers will hate me here, than the goat or the doves or the cattle. Why? Because human life is sacred. Why? Because we're made in God's image. These sacrifices reminded the Israelites that God had power over life and death. But more importantly, that God wanted to show them mercy. What's interesting, and what I found quite, I suppose, wow, is that it wasn't necessarily sinful to be considered ritually unclean. It was more that it's defilement of death that's now tainted you. And the cases of uncleanliness wasn't more about morality, but it was the association of loss of life. Because loss of life is incompatible with God's perfection and life. He's literally the polar opposite of death. And He's not to be associated with any of that, with death. So these rituals reminded them of God, who God is, His nature. So can you imagine having these constant reminders? They set yearly, weekly, daily, to remind this is your God. This is who He is. And so that this little nation would be completely other and distinct and separate to the rest of the world, whose other gods are like volatile, unpredictable. They produce death. God is one of life. So all of this is going through their heads all the time when they're doing these kind of rituals. So God is both known and unknown. He's a mystery. He's a paradox in that He's so incomprehensible to our finite minds, and yet He, as I said, exists out of time and space. He's And yet there's nothing that we can do either by our act of our will or any kind of reasoning to get to know him or experience him on a personal level. And yet, his greatest desire, the most powerful being in the universe, his greatest desire and longing is that we know him and that we be with him and that together we work on his mission. Simply put, God wants you. And he wants you on a permanent basis. So remember that plan? He starts to reveal his plan, and we're going to Isaiah 6. I'm a bit nervous of going to this section because this is the illustration of God's plan starting to shift towards Jesus. So remember now, before they can enter into the tabernacle or the temple, they had to do all these rituals to become pure, right? This is what happens to Isaiah. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. This is interesting. 2 covered their face. Why? They couldn't even look on the glory, the majesty, and the holiness of God. Their faces were covered. 2 covered their feet because they were standing in holy ground, and they had to cover their feet with wings. And 2 they flew. Come on, I want wings, I want to fly. And one called to the other. They were calling to each other. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, or the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth. I mean, they couldn't even say that enough was like holy, holy, holy. They couldn't even say it enough. They had to add the whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who had called. And the house was filled with smoke. It's speaking of his Shekinah glory. And I said, poor old Isaiah. He suddenly finds himself in the throne room in a vision. And he realizes, I'm not pure. I haven't been made ritually pure. So he's going, rightfully so, this guy's a little nervous he's going to die. Because he knows the process that God has set in place. But remember, God's shifting things up here. He says, for I'm lost. He's like, I don't know how I found myself in this place. I must be lost. For I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Now God shifts things up. God knows what's going on in Isaiah's head. He knows what's happening. He knows his fear. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal he had taken with the tongs from the altar. It's interesting, he couldn't with his hands take the coal out of the altar. He had to use tongs. And he touched my mouth, and he said, behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your tin, what a way to ruin a moment. Your sin is atoned for. Suddenly God was giving a glimmer of his plan, the thing that he's changing up. Because before, remember, they had to come in, and sometimes these rituals took time. If you had leprosy, if you were sick, women's menstrual cycles, it took time to become pure again so that you could enter. But now, this case, Isaiah came as he was, and he was transformed. So now something from heaven, taken from the altar of God, made him pure. And now Isaiah is not destroyed. He is transformed. He became clean. He became holy. Because right after that, God says, who's going to go for me? And Isaiah goes, send me. Out of all the angels, heavenly family that's with God, he has a little, which is another part of God's plan, a little through the church, through us, through people. Isaiah says, here, send me. Set apart for a purpose. So now we move on to the New Testament. Jesus became that sacrifice. He was literally on the altar in heaven, where he was taken off. He came to earth to introduce us to the realm, God's realm, his kingdom, his sacred space. So the invitation's now extended to us, not to have a ritual. So all the rituals of the old temple disappeared through Jesus. And the amazing thing is, don't we hear a lot of people say, I'll come to Jesus as soon as I sort myself out? Now you have a way of saying to them, you don't need to. You don't need to sort your stuff out before you come to him. Come to him as you are. And let him touch you, and he will make you pure. He will take every defilement out of you, and he will make you holy, because he is holy. Because one touch from Jesus transforms us. You see, we don't stand in our own righteousness, our own works, our own stuff. We stand in whose righteousness? His righteousness. You can't perform for something that you never really did. You can't lose something that you never really had. So we never have to work for our salvation. We never have to keep working for God's approval. He already gave it before he made us pure. So for our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus makes us fit for God's presence. Now, everything is fulfilled in Jesus. However, those theological lessons that were taught through these rituals, so we don't need the rituals, but the lessons still apply. They teach us how seriously God takes sin, and that we need to be extremely thoughtful in honoring him. By how do we honor God? By admitting, being honest with yourself about your sin, about your failure. Guess what? It's not a surprise to him. It was never based on our performance, never based on our perfection. So why should it carry on afterwards? And to keep trusting in his mercy. So Hebrews 2:17 says, this is why he had to become a man, to take hold of our humanity in every way. He made us his brothers and sisters and became our merciful, faithful king priest before God, as the one who removed our sins to make us one with him. And now, but you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You get to belong in God's family. God calls you, every single one of you, his treasured possession, so that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, you didn't have an identity, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So what does that mean for us? What does it mean that can you understand? And I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to hear the words that I'm saying. In order to be, you are sacred space. So that same presence who dwelt in the Holy of Holies, where one man a year could enter into, dwells in you now. You are now where heaven meets earth. You are that portal. You are also that important to him. And now you have the most powerful being in the universe and beyond who chooses to dwell right here in the middle of you. God, the most powerful, uncreated, the greatest, there is no other, the unique, there is none like him who can match in power and greatness, resides, abides in you now. That takes an awesome responsibility along with the privilege of being his treasured possession. So since God dwells in you, and through his Spirit, every time we gather here on a Sunday, or you gather at life group, or you have a meal together, understand that the ground that you stand on, the ground that we stand on, like the seraphim, covered their feet, this ground becomes holy. God's presence in us makes this ground holy. Puts another whole spin on coming to church. Puts another whole spin on the gathering, worshiping. So when we are here all gathered together and we worship him, it's almost as if God transforms us and we are in heaven, the throne room, worshiping God with the seraphim who still have their wings over their eyes and their feet. But because we have the blood escort of Jesus, we get to stand on holy ground and worship him. That is the privilege we have. But it doesn't end there. We are called to be set apart because each one of us has a significant purpose for his kingdom, and that's to extend Eden. We are called to live life his way. Remember, it's never on our terms. That doesn't fall away. This still is on his terms. We are called to be separate, to be distinct from the world, to live life in such a way that shows the world that we belong to God. Because we get to express the nature of Jesus to everyone around us by the way we live. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a rule set like a guide, okay, this is law, in that if you miss it, you mess up. God's grace is there. He knows we do this imperfectly. But the invitation is to remain faithful in our obedience to God. Why? Because we want to enhance God's reputation. That's part of our mission. So that when we are with him, you know, guys know what I'm going to say, so that to become like him, to do what he is doing. Why do we do that? So that the world will trust. And once they start trusting in the consistency, the predictability, the source, the giver of life, that they see in us, they will want to come to know him. And together, we bless the nations. And together, corporately, we bless the nations. We are called to bless the world, to bless the nations. Every single one of you, I don't care what job you have, your status comes from, your identity comes from where you stand in heaven. So whatever you do and say, do it as a representative of Jesus. I said to Gary, I changed the ending a little bit and I still don't know how to end. Close your eyes. Let's remember what Gary said last week. If we mess up, let's remember. Remember, the core thing of all of this is not about how we're loving Him. It's to remind ourselves how much He loves us. And if something's popped up where you're like, oh, I haven't been a great representative of you, Jesus, or I haven't taken seriously the privilege of being your treasured possession, repent. Turn your face back to God. Say, God, I'm sorry. Admit that this is what I've done. And return back to Him.